Now I'd like to introduce Heidi Altman, who is a seasoned anthropologist with 25 years of experience in linguistic and ethnographic research, focusing on indigenous Mexican, Native American, and African American communities. Her academic work centers on language use in shaping identity, community, and well-being, while her applied research supports Native American communities through language revitalization, behavioral and maternal health, and community-based projects. She has also consulted for the National Park Service on ethnographic projects like the documentation of Blue Ridge Parkway construction. A tenured professor at Georgia Southern University since 2009, her current research addresses Georgia's maternal mortality crisis. Since 2012, she has served on the Georgia Council on American Indian Concerns. Please help me in welcoming Heidi Altman to the Georgia Archives.
Thank you, Henry. I appreciate it. Nice to meet you all. Nice to see you all. Get to meet you later, maybe. As he said, my name is Heidi Altman. I'm a linguistic and applied anthropologist, so that means that I work on language issues, but also on community-based projects that have solutions that communities identify themselves usually. As he said, I've been a member of the Georgia Council on American Indian Concerns since 2012, which is the state's organization that makes sure that if, for example, archaeological discoveries are made that reveal human remains, that they get treated properly and covered back over, or if children come up in the system, that the rules that come from the Indian Child Welfare Act apply, and other things like that. So I'm happy to be here today, and I'm happy to talk to you about the relationship between language and language revitalization and cultural sovereignty. So those two things are kind of complicated issues. I know you all are a well-informed audience, but we'll probably take some time to do a historical overview of the issues that relate to cultural sovereignty for Native American people, and then also how that impacts things like language and then also language revitalization. So as I mentioned, and as Henry mentioned, I'm an anthropologist. I'm not ashamed of that. I know that last night we're talking about anthropologists being observers and stuff, but typically when I work in communities, I am engaged with people and not just going to show up and document things and go away. That's not my practice. But as an anthropologist, I'm always interested in the questions of context. So how do things come to be the way that they are? What's the context for whatever this question is that I'm interested in? And probably if you meet an anthropologist, they will ask you a lot of questions. They're trying to figure out how you fit into their knowledge of the universe. And usually, if they're doing that the right way, they're not going to make you feel uncomfortable. Today, we're interested in talking about tribal sovereignty. So I think we need to take a little review of the federal Indian policy and other things that have happened over time to understand what I mean by tribal sovereignty, and also what policies have changed that over time, almost every decade. An important point to keep in mind is that the indigenous people here in the Southeast were self-governing polities to begin with. And the rest of federal Indian policy is trying to figure out what to do about the people who live where you're trying to take over what they have. So in the Southeast, let's see, we have, as an anthropologist, again, I want to understand how people lived on this land before their lives were interrupted or ended by colonization. From archaeological evidence, we know that there were dozens of tribal entities and hundreds of communities throughout the Southeast when Europeans arrived. At that time, most of the Southeastern peoples were participating in the late Mississippian era culture. And that's where we see large chiefdoms that are starting to break down, and people are becoming less organized, and there's more turmoil among them for many reasons, potentially including environmental change and other stuff that's happening. So at this time, large towns are being dispersed into outlying settlements, and those settlements were oftentimes in conflict with one another. But when Europeans entered that context, they further destabilized the existing governments by amplifying the conflict they met between people. Many of the names on this list, these are names of communities and also potentially languages, have been called, are people that are no longer known to us. Many of them are people that are known to us, but some of them are folks who are no longer known. But the names have been culled from various sources, including historical documents. And I make no promises about the spelling conventions because of that reason. All right. Part of the experience that we want to see clearly is why it seems that Indigenous people here in the Southeast were, as DeSoto said, so easily subdued. So when DeSoto got here and others with him reported abandoned towns, what did that come from? In addition to the existing turmoil among chiefdoms and polities, the European colonial period in the New World saw Indigenous populations decimated first by disease. Academics estimate that between 25 to 90% of the population, as many as 20 million people, were lost to the urban disease that Europeans brought with them, and for which they had no immunity. So, of course, this is a familiar story probably to most of you, that people in Europe were living in proximity with animals and other kinds of urban environments, and so they developed immunities to things like typhus and other stuff like that. Although smallpox is generally thought of as the primary culprit, influenza, measles, typhus, and a host of other communicable diseases were introduced. In terms of culture and language, this is probably the first wave of genocide of people who were knowledge holders. Okay, these are people who were probably the equivalent of first responders, people who were medicine people, people who cared for the sick, people who were spiritual leaders, and so on. Right. Beyond the epidemics that came, we also have a period of war that basically started with DeSoto and lasted off and on over the years, all the way up until the 1850s. And then by then, we also have the removal to contend with, which I'll talk about in a second. So in the Southeast, there was nearly constant war between Indigenous people, and then also between them and the colonists and the Federals they interacted with. The wars continued to amplify and aggravate pre-existing divisions within people. Communities were forced to take sides with one European power or another, or sometimes they also were acting against one another. Also during this era, we see the explosion of the deerskin trade. So in 1680, that's really the beginning of the deerskin trade in the Southeast. And that trade was really the beginning of the assimilation period in the Southeast. Trade shaped relationships between Native Americans and European colonists, influenced social structures, economies, and power dynamics in the region. So at one point they were producing, I used to know this off the top of my head, but it was like millions of tons of deer skins a year to make up for the beaver trade that had collapsed, right? So this is all sort of due to fashion and other ideas, but one thing becomes popular, then that idea or the markets for that collapse. So something else becomes popular, and we still see that today, obviously. In addition to warfare, disease, and the other things that are happening, we also see that missionization is another significant aspect of forced assimilation. And that is, excuse me. And in the Southeast, this began with Spanish missions in Florida from the 1600s and included things that we all probably have heard of or know about, including the Moravian missions to the Cherokees in North Georgia and the Brainerd mission, other things like that. In the process of missionization, missionaries aggressively pushed for the conversion of Native Americans to Catholicism or other forms of Christianity. The mission system was aimed to replace traditional Indigenous customs, language, and beliefs with European practices, leading to a loss of cultural identity. And Native people were forced to work under labor exploitation conditions, often under harsh conditions, to maintain the infrastructure and produce crops. People were also put together in closed spaces, and that also, those close living quarters within the missions contributed, again, also to the rapid spread of disease, causing significant population decline again among Indigenous communities. However, many tribes actively resisted missionization through rebellions and fleeing from the missions, and then also maintaining their practices in secret. So here we start to see, with these first three elements here, disease, war, and missionization, that the traditional structures that had existed and even the numbers of people that existed are starting to become decimated. And so when we look at Indian sovereignty up to this point, there's not really the same kind of notion of sovereignty that you might think about as we start talking about things further along. People did engage in treaties. I'll talk about that in a second, why that's important. But at the same time, it was not the indigenous people in the Southeast and other places were not able to necessarily control their own destiny, as you might think, when we talk about sovereignty. All right, so everyone who's ever taken any schooling in Georgia has read about the removal or learned about the removal, also known as the Trail of Tears among Cherokee folks. And the legal decisions and political actions that resulted in the removal were centered around the idea of tribal sovereignty, and we begin to see the conflict of policy and precedent in this era. The federal government had been entering into treaties with tribal governments, treating them as sovereigns within. So this is sort of like a logic problem, right? You can't be a sovereign nation that also has sovereign nations within it, right? That's sort of an oxymoron. So, but that was the position the U.S. government found themselves in at this point. Each tribal government that treated with the federal government had its own rules and outcomes. In the case of the removal, the issues at hand revolved around the expansion of the rights of the state of Georgia to offer licenses especially regarding offer licenses on land held by Indian folks. And in that case, the Supreme Court upheld the principle of individual sovereignty, and they upheld the idea that the federal government's actions superseded the states. But Andrew Jackson disagreed and signed the Indian Removal Act, and that set into motion the removal of all Indians east of the Mississippi. The Indian Removal Act fractured the principle of tribal sovereignty and strengthened the government's position that tribes could be displaced by treaty. Okay, so now we've got a new element in play, which is that you can move people by treaty. You can have treaties with people and then also remove them from that. So through the Indian Removal Act, the federal government gained plenary authority, meaning they have their own sovereignty, but we get to oversee them over tribal governments. After this point, tribal sovereignty became a fairly hollow principle for some time. During the 19th century, the federal government entered into countless treaties with tribal governments only to break them and not live up to the promises made. In 1871, the practice of making treaties with tribes and legally the Indian Allocation Act ended the practice of making treaties with tribes and legally designated them as individuals under federal guardianship or wards of the state. Okay, so at that point, not only can they remove you, but you are also now a dependent of the state, and that there's no tribal sovereignty in that, right? Because every individual is a ward of the state. Next, in our tour of disenfranchisement and robbing people of their sovereignty comes the Dawes Act, or the allotment period. Once the principle of tribal sovereignty had been decimated, the federal government proceeded with the intention of breaking tribal cohesion and setting people against one another. Allotment broke up lands once held in common by tribal governments and allotted each family a parcel for grazing or agriculture. The remaining lands were sold to non-Indian people. The Dawes Act also established the Dawes Rolls. I heard you all talking about the Dawes Rolls earlier, which allowed the federal government to determine who was or was not a Native person based on whether or not their family was on the roll. The goal was to take the wards of the government out of communal tribal settings and have them assimilate into the pioneer culture of the West. And it didn't apply to everybody in the West. We were talking about that. This is really specifically originally in Oklahoma, and there was some spread from there, but that was the main thing, was in Oklahoma. That's where people still have allotment lands today in Oklahoma. So that's happening. At the same time, as the Dawes Act, we have the government, under the direction of Colonel Richard Henry Platt, developing the Indian boarding school system to further force assimilation on Indigenous people. The overarching principle was, as Pratt said, to kill the Indian and save the man. One of the primary goals of the boarding school system was to eliminate Native languages. So here we've basically eliminated all of the tribal sovereignty we can possibly do through the federal government. And now we're also going to quash the languages, because why should you speak these languages anymore? Children as young as 5 or 6 were taken from their families and placed in schools with people from other tribal nations so that they had no language in common but English. Native languages were forbidden, and punishments were meted out to anyone heard speaking anything other than English. And this set into motion many of the social factors that led to the decline of native languages in the 20th century. Schools, there were hundreds of Indian boarding schools, I think 573 Indian boarding schools built in the 19th century, and many of them persisted into the 20th century. Until the 1960s, they were still operating as boarding schools. The conditions at the schools were widely variable, but assimilation and vocational education in the service fields were primary goals. By 1926, nearly 80% of school-age Indian children were in the boarding schools. Abuse was rampant, sexual abuse, physical abuse, anything you can imagine. And children died, ran away, or disappeared. So some families never saw their children again, and they never knew what happened. The institutionalized cruelty for speaking one's native language led many who survived to not speak the language around their children so that they wouldn't have to go through the same thing. So this is sort of the big catalyst for language loss, right? The Indian boarding schools. All right. So that's the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Beginning of the 20th century, we have World War I. There were a large number of Native American veterans who participated in World War I. And so when they came back, the American Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 granted full U.S. citizenship to all Native Americans born within the United States, which is ironic, I know, essentially giving them the same legal rights and protections as other citizens, including the right to vote, regardless of their tribal affiliation. It's also known as the Snyder Act, if you're interested in it. This was done in appreciation of the service of Native American veterans in World War I. But despite the act, states still determined who could vote, and Jim Crow laws often applied to Native American folks as well as African American folks, and stopping them from voting. So if you notice, this is about every 10 years something happens, and in the 20th century it gets even more regular. All right. So after people are, they're citizens, they're people. They decide finally to have the Indian New Deal, or the Indian Reorganization Act, which ended many of the previous federal Indian policies that I was just talking about. That included ending the allotment period or allotment practices, ending the state ward status for Native people or the dependent status, ending the boarding school era. And it also included buying back lands for communities. So they put millions of dollars into buying back land from people that they had sold it to, and other lands to have land for communities. It was an important step toward righting some longstanding wrongs. However, not everyone trusted the government. I mean, imagine why that would be. And tribal governments had to vote on whether or not to participate in the Reorganization Act. 67 tribes, including the Navajo, voted against it. The Navajo were mad that they had been forced to kill a large number of sheep to stop land erosion, and so they voted against it. Although many saw it as the white government's solution to the problems they had made, it did change once again the relationship of the federal government to the sovereign nations within. So we're starting to move in a direction of saying, okay, well, we want to try to do better, but then in the 1950s, we have termination and relocation. So the goal of termination, after all of this work in the 1930s under the Indian Reorganization Act, we have termination, which the goal of which was to assimilate Native Americans into mainstream society by eliminating their tribal status and federal dependence. So we go through this whole period in the 30s of trying to reestablish tribal governments and reestablish tribal sovereignty. And then in the 50s, we decide, no, we're going to terminate this and be done with it because we don't want to have any more federal dependence. The policy involved terminating federal recognition of tribes, meaning that they would no longer be considered sovereign nations and they would lose access to federal services like healthcare and education. There was also a relocation program that was run at approximately the same time. And that policy basically actively encouraged. In fact, they had buses that made loops from, Indian country to California on the regular, that actively encouraged Native Americans to leave their reservations and move to more urban centers, often providing limited financial assistance for housing and job search. And so if you have ever been to Oakland, California, in Oakland and New York City and a few other places, there are some real hubs for Native American urban Indian folks that live there. Those are folks that went on relocation and stayed there and reestablished communities, but they're usually what we would consider to be pan-Indian communities. They're a mix of people because it wasn't always the same people from the same tribe going to the same place. So the negative aspects of this include that it often resulted in significant social and economic hardship for Native Americans due to a lack of access to traditional lands, caused cultural disruption and challenges finding stable employment in unfamiliar urban environments. It separated people from their families also, right? So a lot of the people living on the reservation or on Indian lands, however you want to configure that, depended on their families for support in all kinds of ways, for financial support, but also lived in proximity to one another, shared childcare, shared all these things. And when you send somebody out away from that into an urban environment, they're cut off from all that kind of support, social support they might have once had. So after the 1950s, we have civil rights movement. And during the civil rights movement, of course, this is a struggle for equal rights for everybody. But the Native rights struggle was about the right of Native nations to exist as distinct sovereign nations. The most pressing issue at the time was that policy of termination we were just talking about. So the Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968 is a federal law that protects the rights of American Indians and non-Indians by imposing Bill of Rights-like protections on tribal governments. The ICRA is also known as the Indian Bill of Rights. It includes the following protections: freedom of religion, speech, and press, right to be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures, right to a speedy public trial, right to effective assistance of counsel, freedom from prosecution of more than once for the same offense. It also limits the punishment that tribal courts can impose and expands the sentencing authority of Indian tribes. The ICRA was amended in 1986, and that had to do with some of the stuff to do with jurisdictions in the courts. But the best things about it are that they were trying to, I don't know if this is actually true, but it says, they're trying to end systematic and individual discrimination and racism against Native Americans. I would like to believe that that was the result of this, but certainly that's what they were trying for. They improved living conditions and employment circumstances for Native Americans and ended the exploitation of natural resources by the federal government, especially those things that were on Native land, okay? So we see here this sort of other track happening in the civil rights movement for Native American folks. And want to believe that these are all good, but we'll see that we have to have other things beyond this, okay? This is also, I didn't mention the American Indian movement, but that's, so the American Indian movement is also established at this time, and this is sort of the Native American civil rights activist group that does a number of things, but basically they are protesting and fighting for the rights of Native American folks. And that was also the second Wounded Knee and stuff that you've probably already heard about. Despite the assurance of protections for religious belief, in 1978, we have to have the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which is passed in response to allegations that state and federal laws were disrupting Native American religious practices. The law made it illegal to prohibit Native American spiritual practices. And this even includes things like being able to wear your hair a certain way if you're in prison, for example. I had people contact me one time from a prison to ask about this because somebody in the prison, and it was not a prison that normally housed Native American prisoners, but they were asking about what was supposed to be allowed under this law. So it can be a number of things, but basically anything that relates to your spiritual practice is protected by federal law. And that's a secondary reinforcement of this Civil Rights Act, okay? It also established that the United States would protect and preserve the right of American Indians to practice their traditional religions. So the things that you want to do to practice those, that includes rights to access sacred sites, to use sacred objects, and perform traditional ceremonies. So you may have heard about people who have eagle feathers, and you have to go through a whole lot of paperwork to have legally an eagle feather because they're not supposed to be collected. But if that's part of your spiritual practice and you're part of a recognized tribe, you can go through IRFA and have the paperwork done so that you can have those feathers. Similarly, if you want to have access to sites that are prohibited, that have prohibited access, then this would allow you to do that if you can prove that you're covered under this. So it required the federal government and all federal agencies to evaluate their policies and procedures and to consult with Native religious leaders, and then to also determine what changes needed to be done. About the same time as the IRFA, we also have the Indigenous Self-Determination and Educational Assistance Act, and this is in 1975. It gives Native American tribes more control over their own affairs, including managing federal funding for education, health, and social services. The law allows tribes to contract with the federal government to provide services such as construction projects and to be involved in the direction of those services. In addition, in 1978, we have the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is a federal law that governs the removal and out-of-home placement of American Indian and Alaska Native children and youth. The law was enacted after the federal government recognized that those children were being removed from their homes and communities at a severely disproportionate rate compared to non-American Indian Alaska Native children. And so what that law says is that if a child comes into custody who is a Native child, you need to find family first to place them with. And if not that, then you need to find someone who has the same cultural beliefs and practices. And if not that, then you need to find someone who will provide for that or whatever. But it's trying to look out for the welfare of kids because, and this is just an aside, like in the 1950s, there were what they used to call hygiene programs where they would go around and state governments and federal governments would say, you know, your house isn't proper, your house isn't clean, your children don't live the way we think they should live, which were almost all Western white ways of living. And so if that was the case, they'd remove your children from your home and put them in the system, and you might not see them again, you might not. But those ways of living that were being prescribed against by the governments were oftentimes traditional ways of living where kids live in an age cohort together. And maybe tonight they're at my house, and maybe tomorrow night they're at my sister's house or whatever, but they're together with other people their age and they're always cared for. But that doesn't look right to people from outside of that culture, right? So ICWA was an attempt to readdress some of those issues that had happened to young people being taken out of their parents' custody. So these are all things that are starting along the path toward people in communities having more tribal sovereignty over themselves. We're getting along the way here where you can have your children not taken from you. You can have contracts and educational programs with the government that are supported by this. You have religious freedom, you have civil rights. So this is getting better. Then in 1988, we have the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which was enacted by the United States Congress to regulate the conduct of gaming on Indian lands. And so for a long time, a lot of tribal communities have had things like bingo or, I mean, games of chance are common in a lot of different Native American communities. Some of them over the years turned them into bingo halls and stuff. So if you look at the Seminoles of Florida, started with a bingo hall or 5, and now they own the Hard Rock, not just their Hard Rock, but the Hard Rock. So everyone that owns local Hard Rock franchises from them, right? So that's a very big change in, in gaming over that period of time. But the point of this is that people had bingo halls and things like that, and they were starting to engage in different kinds of gambling. And so the federal government wanted to get their hands on that. But also, this made it so that people who want to have gaming on their lands have to make a compact with the state. So in North Carolina, the ACI have casinos, but that's not just something they decided to do. They have to make agreements with the state of North Carolina, and they have to also go through a whole bunch of procedures and probably, there's probably money involved, stuff like that, right? So that's what the Indian Gaming Regulation Act brings. And so it establishes the sovereign right for tribal entities to allow and profit from gaming on tribal lands. But it also includes that compaction issue and for federal oversight through the Indian Gaming Commission. So there's also a commission, this National Indian Gaming Commission, that is associated with that. Although not all tribes have gaming enterprises, the law and the resulting revenue streams have contributed to economic development in tribal communities, including community grants, per capita payments in some cases, and the attraction of tourism. Somebody is trying to call me on the Zoom here. It's okay. Anyway, so people don't always have this, but when they do, it brings in a fair amount of money, and it also contributes to the economic development in the area, and it also brings in tourism for other things. Sometimes people get per capita payouts, and sometimes it's just more tourism and other related industries and enterprises. By the same brush here, we also can look at all kinds of manufacturing in Native communities. So there's all kinds of different manufacturing plants, and like there was a famous car radio makers in Mississippi associated with I think the Mississippi Choctaw at one point. There's also relationships between tribes and all kinds of like chemical plants and stuff like that. There's all kinds of things that are happening in terms of manufacturing and other economic development at this point. All right, so in 1990, we start to see that not only are people, they have right to their own education, they have right to their own money, they have right to do the things that, you would think anybody would be able to do, but we start to get other legislation that's passed specifically to protect Native Americans. First, we have the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which has provided jobs for many archaeologists over the years. But basically, that says that anything that you have as a museum, as a university, or any entity that receives federal funding, if you have Native American remains, Native American ceremonial objects, grave goods, any of that stuff, you have to put those things into the process of consultation with the tribes that they belong to. And so if you don't do that, there are significant federal consequences for that. But most people have spent the past 30 years trying to get all that together. In the past, I would say 5 or 10 years, they've started to really prosecute those cases. So you have to be able to put these things into consultation, demonstrate to the tribe what you have, whatever they want to have reburied is reburied, whatever they don't care about, they don't care about, whatever, but you need to be in contact and consultation with communities. That's an ongoing process here in Georgia. It's an ongoing process in lots of states where there are consultation processes going on over major sites. In addition to NAGPRA, there's also the Indian Arts and Crafts Act of 1990, and that protects Native American artists by preventing misrepresentation of Indian arts and crafts in the market. So you get a card that says that you are really actually a Native American person if you're going to be selling stuff. And that protects people from having fake stuff made that says it's Indian or having, ideas stolen, all that kind of stuff. And then, importantly, for our interest today, in 1990, we have the Native American Languages Act, which supports the preservation and revitalization of Native American languages. The fundamental basis of the policy's declaration was that the United States declares to preserve, protect, and promote the rights and freedom of Native Americans to use, practice, and develop Native American languages, which is a far cry from kill the Indian, save the man. So at least we finally have enshrined in federal law that languages should be protected. All right. So that's a quick and dirty rundown of the issues related to sovereignty. All right. And where language fits in there. I want to talk quickly about revitalization movements. So anthropologists are interested in revitalization movements because they tell us a lot of things about the aspirations and hopes of a community that has been in turmoil or experienced colonization. Revitalization movements also teach us about how power can be redistributed to promote new community engagement and stabilization. So there's a lot of really interesting things about this. And I could give you a whole anthropology lecture, just revitalization movements, because they're really fascinating. But today we'll focus on 3 of these. that have to do with Native Americans. All right, so in the 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries, we have three main, at least for us three main revitalization movements that I'm going to talk about today, put it that way. First, we have the Handsome Lake religion, which is up in the Northeast. And the Handsome Lake religion, that's Handsome Lake there. And basically this revived traditional Haudenosaunee religious beliefs about and cultural values after colonization. So there were traditional beliefs that people in the Haudenosaunee believed, and then he said we need to reestablish those ideas. It also includes the creator's message to stop drinking and other evil habits. So this was something that had become a significant issue in the area through trade and assimilation and stuff, was drinking. And then ceremonies were held in the Longhouse communities to remind people of the message. Originally, this was called the New Religion because it's new in opposition to people's traditionally animistic beliefs, but now it's known as the Old Way in opposition to Christianity. So that's something that people still talk about. I don't know how widely it's still practiced, but it's still something that people hold as value because there are good values associated with it. The next one we want to talk about is the Ghost Dance religion. That's Wovoka there, or also Jack Wilson is his American name. But the Ghost Dance originated in Nevada with the Northern Paiute folks, and it spread to the Great Plains later in the 19th century. The belief in this Ghost Dance is that the dead would return, that the spirits of the dead would be raised and return to live with the living, that the buffalo would return because the bison population had been hunted to near extinction, and that European settlers would be driven away, that white people would be driven out and Native Americans could reclaim their lands. And they also believed that the world would be renewed and that Native Americans would regain their traditional way of life. And that if you did the Ghost Dance, it would hasten all of this, that it would hasten the return of the dead. It was a central part, the dance itself was a central part of the ritual and would be spread around among communities, and they felt like the more people that they got dancing, the quicker the dead would come back and these things would get moving along. A moral code should be followed that wasn't too different from Christian teaching, but people should be, in good moral standing. So the Ghost Dance was a complex of religious movements that connected different Native American nations. So some folks did their own Ghost Dance. The Paiutes had their kind, the Lakota had their kind, so on. The Ghost Dance didn't really catch on in the Southeast because people in the Southeast don't really want to think about the dead coming back to life. That's like a cultural taboo. You don't want, it's not really the same kind of thing. But the Bureau of Indian Affairs regarded the Ghost Dance as a threat and ordered the arrest of Sitting Bull, who claimed to be the ringleader. Belief in the Ghost Dance led Lakota leaders not to assimilate with the Dawes Act. And the Wounded Knee Massacre, the first one, took place during a Ghost Dance. So the idea that people are out there doing these things, that they're trying to hasten the decline of Western civilization, freaked out the BIA, and they felt like that was probably not a good thing for them to be doing. I will also say that the belief, especially among some of the Plains tribes about the Ghost Dance, is that you would be protected if you wore Ghost Dance shirts, for example, or if you were doing things the right way, you would be protected from bullets and things like that. And so a lot of people continued on, and like at the Wounded Knee Massacre, people were massacred during this event. The last one I'm going to talk about that relates to Cherokee is the Nighthawk Kituwa Society, led by Redbird Smith, a prophet, leader, and chief. He insisted that his people adapt and change to survive. So one of his primary beliefs is that we're going to do what we have to do to survive. And he managed to keep people together through some really hard times in Oklahoma. So I don't know if you all are from the South. I don't know if you know what happened after removal. So people get to Oklahoma. They've been through the Trail of Tears and all the things that happened there. They were promised the new Indian state or Indian territory. And then in 1906, they make Oklahoma a state. Right. So the idea of Indian territory is all a lie, like the other treaties that have been broken. So Redbird Smith kept people together through all of that. Today, in Oklahoma, there are Cherokee stomp dances that feature sermons delivered in the language. And the Nighthawk Katua Society has has rules similar to other revitalistic movements, including a code of behavior with the goal of restoring traditional society and an uplifting message for the people who are participating. All right, so we have sovereignty, we have the basics of revitalization. Now we need to look at languages quickly. All right, so looking at this, when we examine the depth and breadth of the languages and language families in North America, it becomes clear that different groups and migrations of people settled here long before even most of our archaeological evidence indicates. Language diversity languages diversify at a pretty predictable rate, although that's also controversial. I won't get into the linguistic details of like time change and all that stuff. It's a lot. But the idea is that, you know, you can sort of trace the connectedness between languages back to about 10,000 years, right? And when you have separations, that these are all, these are not languages. These are like the level above. They're language stocks or language families. And so when you have that much diversity at that level of time, it indicates that there are probably people here, or at least people were very different from each other when they got here. There's all kinds of different ways you could look at that. But we don't know whether people came here with these diverse languages, or did they diversify in place, as a lot of Native people would tell you that we've been here that long, and that's why that is that way. But these are questions where archaeology, linguistics, and oral histories are like in a tizzy all the time. Argument. When I was in graduate school, I was in the linguistic anthropology program, and we had a lot of archaeologists who would very firmly stand by the Clovis horizon. That was it. And we were, as linguists, were like, no, look at this, right? You can't have one 10,000 year period. So over time, I'm, kind of gratified to say that that's sort of been shown to be not exactly right, but still, that is a lot of diversity for the time frame that we have any idea about, right? So that makes us wonder what's happening here. All right. So from the 500 or so known languages, the US has about 150 languages left that still have speakers. The diversity of the different language families still exists, so that map is still fairly represented. But we don't have a lot of speakers left. And they're all in danger of being lost in the next generation or two, depending on what happens, right? So if a community has fluent speakers and the fluent speakers are all over 50, the language dies with the speakers, right? Because they're not making new speakers, they're not raising children. They may not be speaking to their grandchildren in the language because of their experiences with the boarding school. There's all kinds of reasons why that's sort of a cutoff, right? So if you're not making new speakers, then the language will be gone. In addition, we have these sort of contemporary factors, educational norms that encourage a lot of students to go into English-speaking schools. And sometimes you encounter this even with immersion schools, like parents. And I mean, it's a lot to ask of a parent to put their kid in a school where they're going to learn a language that you don't speak as the parent, right? That's a lot. And sometimes parents worry about the developmental stage, that their kids are going to miss developmental milestones. But for the most part, kids who grow up bilingual like that, stably bilingual like that, one language in one context, one language in the other, they hit all their milestones. It's no problem. But people do worry about that. People worry about employability as a native language speaker. So if I only speak this language, and this was an issue for people maybe 40 years ago when they grew up sort of monolingual and they wanted to get a job, and the job that they wanted to get didn't have translation of nursing terms or something like that into Cherokee or into Navajo or whatever. They would sort of switch languages so that they could get a job. And then also, let's see, the fact that many people are over 50, as I said, and the legacy of boarding schools are weighing on them. They don't want to put their grandchildren through this. I think we moved past that finally, but that was an issue when people first started talking about language revitalization. And sometimes it takes people a while to overcome that trauma. So if you've been through boarding school and you've been traumatized, it's not like, you probably have in your heart somewhere the desire to speak your language, but it's hard to overcome what you've lived through for a long time, even when you know there are people in your community who might speak your language, but you don't even speak to each other because you don't want to be, dredging all that up. So luckily, in the last 15 years or so, 2006, the Esther Martinez Native American Language Preservation Act passed. So we're getting more and more back to sovereignty here. And in that federal program, it provides for actual programming designed to bring languages back into the spoken realm. So the provisions of the act are drawn from successful language nest and revitalization programs that originated in New Zealand, Hawaii, and the Mohawk Nation. I'll talk about those in a minute. But using successful methods that have been proven in communities, this legislation establishes a granting structure that supports language learning at all levels. So they have language funding for language nests, which are basically like infant to preschool age, where kids are immersed in the language all day, but also things for other people in the community. So you don't have to just stay with, just put all the weight on the children to learn the language, right? All right. So I'm going to skip over that. Okay. So these are some things coming up here are some of the best known language revitalization programs and why they were or how they were successful, what the cultural significance of cultural revitalization is. And so, excuse me, you might wonder why that matters. I mean, sometimes I do talk to people and they're like, so what if you don't speak your language? You speak English, who cares, right? Most of us probably don't feel that way because we're here on this Saturday listening to this kind of talk, but a lot of people don't understand the significance of that. So when I was a graduate student in California, I worked with a program that assisted Indigenous communities in retrieving archival records of their language and then helping them interpret linguistic speak so they could get their words back out of there, what they sounded like. And so for those folks, to be able to sing a song or say a prayer in the language was the only thing they were trying to be able to do, right? They knew that their language was probably not going to be spoken like fluently, but to be able to sing or pray is really important. It's important because maybe they lost their last speaker decades ago. Excuse me. That's the deepest connection to culture that they have. And without it, it's hard to practice the religion. It's hard to maintain your identity as something separate from the culture you've been assimilated into. It's hard to feel connected to the ancestors who came before. The revitalization of language is a deeply spiritual practice that would be impossible without tribal sovereignty. So we go back to that, right? So if we don't have tribal sovereignty and the things that have come out of that, then we can't get back to this place of cultural revitalization. Excuse me. So I just want to look at these real quick. These are some famous, in the nerd world, these are famous linguistic revitalization programs. First of all, we have the Maori Te Kahungureo, the language nests that are there. And this program began in the 70s, and they had infants and children immersed in the language. New Zealand has been very supportive of this, right? So New Zealand has a totally different attitude toward, well, nowadays, toward their Indigenous people than the US has had for a long time. And so they're setting goals in the government for fluency among people. They want to have a certain percentage of people fluent by 2040. And also that's across the government and across the populace. It doesn't matter if you're a white person, they want you to learn Maori too, so that you can learn about your relationship to the culture that you're in. They also have curricula in primary, secondary, university, and graduate programs in the language, so you can take a master's degree in engineering in Maori language, right? So that's pretty interesting. For speakers, the language is seen as integral to their cultural and spiritual practice. And everybody, like I said, everybody learns the language. And it's also part of like one of those things that people think makes New Zealand cool, right? It's kind of interesting. All right. Sort of the next wave of this, and not unrelated to New Zealand, are Hawaiian folks. And so the Hawaiian folks, in the 1970s, it was illegal to speak Hawaiian in Hawaii. You were not allowed to use it, teach it, hear it, whatever. But the parents of some kids at that point decided that they were going to force this change, right? So they started these language nest schools there, a grassroots movement. They're really focused on family involvement, like really focus on family involvement. Like if you want your kid to be in the school, you have to put in time to help out in the school and stuff like that. I met some of these folks about 10 years ago. They came to visit and they brought two little kids with them. So the adults were coming to talk to us about the language program. The little kids were on perfect behavior the whole time because there's this whole idea that you are representing your culture. And if you don't represent us well, we're not happy about that, right? So it's maybe, it's a very family focused, but also very, you have to do the right thing kind of focus, right? And so they worked with the Maori of New Zealand, and they also began teaching Hawaiian curriculum with no English in the classroom, similar to that. And so right now, there are 11 preschools statewide, and there are also 14 public schools into which the kids matriculate. And there are 2 model schools on the island of Hawaii. And then I think they also have some programs where you can even take a PhD in the Hawaiian, like through the Hawaiian language, not just in Hawaiian, but like, I forget what the subject matter is, but. All right, so those 2 early ones sort of related out there. We also have the Akwesasne Freedom School, which is in Mohawk territory. And this is a school that was started because there were pollutants and chemicals being dumped into the water. So they were trying to get people to leave and they didn't want to leave. And so they started their own school. They stayed there and started their own school. So the school was founded in 1979 by Mohawk parents who were concerned that the language and culture would die. And by 1985, the Mohawk Immersion Program had begun. It's the only program of its kind that works like it does in the US. There are others that work differently. The Mohawk Thanksgiving Address, which teaches gratitude to the earth and everything on it, literally, like it is a very long address that addresses all of the animals, the trees, the air, the birds, everything. It can go on for quite some time. Is used as the curriculum base. So if you want to be able to give the Mohawk Thanksgiving address, you've got to learn all the animals. You've got to learn all the right ways to talk about them, so on. So it combines academics, but also a very strong foundation in Mohawk culture. And they also have lots of other cultural practices that are being revived. So things like life passage events for young women, for example. So they'll have, a whole thing where the community comes together, especially the women will come together around a group of young girls as they go through the passage to menstruation or as they go through the passage to womanhood or whatever. So there's a lot of really intense cultural stuff that goes along with it as well. The next one I want to mention is the Pagan Institute in Nizipuwashin School, which is in the Blackfoot Nation. And they had to import speakers. They really didn't have any or many speakers left. And so they had a neighboring dialect in Canada that came and taught people. And the Blackfoot homeland has a lot of unemployment, a lot of educational issues. There's all kinds of social issues there, but instituting the immersion school and the Language Institute, which studies the language and produces materials and a bunch of other stuff, they've been the leaders in economic renewal and economic development for the community. So they've gotten grocery stores in and stuff. You wouldn't think that's a big deal, but in the middle of nowhere, it's a big deal, right? So it's important to have grocery stores. It's important to have tourism and other economic drivers. And so the work that's being done around the Language Institute is also driving those things, okay? Finally, in North Carolina, they had the Katua Preservation Education Program, the New Katua Academy. And I have some experience with this, but as the community began to have economic development that was substantial, they use their money half in community, half goes out to the people in the community, but half goes into community funded grants. And so you can write a grant to do language revitalization, you can write a grant to do a number of different things, but basically this is a way for all that economic development to feed back into cultural and linguistic revitalization. The casino most recent figure I saw is that the casino contributes over $200 million a year to the local economy, and increases tourism to the area. And so that's all stuff that goes back into the community as well to develop there. So this immersion school used to be the old Chestnut Tree Hotel, if you're familiar with Cherokee, but it is incredibly beautiful. It has running water in it. I mean, it's just amazing. And they have a three-phase, sort of three-part program, which is community engagement, immersion school for kids, and then teacher training. So they want to have lots and lots of teachers who are able to teach the language. And Dr. Moore stole my picture, but I also want to mention that not just do we have a Secretary of the Interior, Deb Holland, who's from Laguna Pueblo, but the ability to think, talk, and feel in one's own language that was denied to generations is being restored. And the appointment of Deb Holland, after a long career in public service and politics in New Mexico and Laguna Pueblo, she's continued to expand the support for and revitalization of Native languages. She convenes cabinet leaders whose positions have relations to Native American communities 3 times a year to hear and consult on issues. In 2022, that included discussions around the implementation of the Native Languages Memorandum of Agreement, which had been announced the year before, in which all of the departments of the Interior, Education, Health and Human Services, Agriculture, and 7 other signatory agencies signed on to address barriers to Native language revitalization, supporting integration of Native language instruction and language into educational settings, and strengthening tribal consultation around Native languages. So that's sort of the state of things, going from having no sovereignty to finally getting things turned back around. So I just want to thank you for your time. I'm happy to take questions. If you need to reach me, these are my numbers. Anybody have a question? Nope. Yes.
But maybe a little bit off topic, but has anybody found a linguistic tie to any Asian languages and Native American to, cross that little Bering Strait thing?
Right. Well, so certainly, now this is sort of a wee bit outside my area, so please, but certainly the people that are closer to the Bering Strait, those relationships are easier to see. So people in Alaska and northern Canada, those relationships between languages are easier to see. And then some of the languages on the interior of Alaska that go from interior Alaska all the way down to Navajo, the Dene languages, are all related. That's a big swath of languages that kind of look like a T-Rex when you look at it on a map. But they're not easily related, right? So the languages and there are theories, so there are a lot of people who have these sort of grand language theories where they try to go back and find the one language, but after a point, it's not mathematically feasible, right? It doesn't work. So yes and no. I don't know if that answered your question or not.
Well, it does, because a yes and no is more, I didn't have that much. So.
Right, anything else?
I just had a comment. They are coming out technology in 2024.
Yep.
There are a lot of apps out there.
Yes.
I actually have one for the Anishinaabe.
Yes.
And I'm learning that.
It's taken a long time. So here's the difficulty, right? So when I was really working on this about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, really involved with it, the problem was that there wasn't enough documentation of languages to put into an app. So you could make little apps like games and stuff and just have, whatever, like label things in the game or whatever. That was sort of the beginning. But now there's enough documentation of languages that you can do things like that. And it's really cool. And the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma in particular has been working with Apple. So you can have Cherokee syllabary on your Apple devices. You can have all kinds of, there's all kinds of advancements that way as well. So, and that's a whole special additional thing in terms of writing, so, but yeah. Great. All right. Anything else? Yes.
One question.
Just a comment as well. I've been studying my language, and don't make sure to look outside of the box. We always go look I have to go to Georgia to learn about Cherokee or
Right.
Oklahoma. I went to a conference last year in California, and I did not realize that stuff from California is all over the place.
Yes.
Like you said, like was mentioned in one of the earlier talks, that they sent baskets and food and stuff to another place just to gain. So look in other places as well.
Absolutely.
Just look outside of the box.
There is, so if you go to University of California at Berkeley,
That's where I went.
yes,
Breath of life.
yes, that's where, that's what I worked on when I was a graduate student there. But, so in doing that, they have enormous archives, as you know, and they have languages from all over the country. So any kind of thing.
Yeah, we got affected by the NAGPRA. I just went this past May and could not get into one of the museums because they sit down until they reached every, that was the main one that I really, Bancroft Library was closed down. We couldn't go in. But
Yeah.
they had things that I could actually see that my great grands wore, but I couldn't see it because of NAGPRA.
Well, but to be fair, NAGPRA is a good thing. I mean, yeah, it's not good in that moment, but you know,
Right.
hopefully they're,
But you have to know. And then what happens if we are not a federally recognized tribe? So who do you go to get permissions?
correct.
So it does open up a lot of other thoughts and ways and
Yes.
things that need to be done as
Yes,
well.
I work on the Georgia Council, and the 3 state recognized tribes are not federally recognized tribes, and so they go through this all the time with, you know, the back and forth on that, which I'll leave aside the other day.
Yeah, that's a whole.
It's
It's a lot,
complicated.
but, and then to your point, just language and who you are. For the first time in my life, 59 years, I can now say words, I can now respond. And even though we don't have our language in an app or anything, the more that I text my language to people, the more my phone likes it.
Yes.
And then the words just pop up.
Yes,
So if I say thank you all the time, you know,
and even if you're just saying thank you in your language, that is still part of who you are, right?
it's, well, that's a, endearing term. So you do feel it.
yes.
You do feel it. It's
Right.
amazing.
Anybody else? Comments? Complaints? Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much, Dr. Orman.